Thank you.
Perfect.
So thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Ellie, for organizing the event and everyone else who was also involved in the organization of the event. It is great to be part of this group. I've been attending as when Will indicated that this has been going on for some years and mentioned the year. It was like, oh, I think I've been there since the beginning. So it's great to be here. But now I kind of switch hats. I used to be presenting. Now I'm going to be discussing. So you can get a sense of the time that I've been around, that I'm now transitioning to being more discussant. So it's great to have this series of papers. I found them very interesting. So what I'll do, I'll try to put them together, the main results have been presented. There was one paper that unfortunately was not able to present. The presenter wasn't able to join the session. So what I'll do is when I get to that, to giving comments to that paper, I'll show you a little bit of what the paper was about. And then so you can get a sense of what they were trying to do in that particular paper. So for now, let me focus on the 4 papers that we had. We heard from the first 3. The first paper is somewhat different from the last 3 in the sense that the first paper focuses more on period effects, and it looks at socioeconomic differences in mortality using data in particularly for the US, in contrast to the last 3 papers that tend to assess a little bit more changes in cohorts. So for me, that was quite exciting because I focus quite a lot on my work on always paying attention to the cohort differences and the life course experiences of these cohorts. So let me put them somewhat in a single slide, a little bit of the main results. For example, in the period paper, that was looking at the SES differences in mortality, how they have increased over time or in recent times. 3 pieces that I found quite interesting: that in heart disease, they seem to be relatively similar, those SES differences, at least similar since the 1995s. In terms of lung cancer, in contrast, there seems to have been a decline in the last decade, at least, in the SES difference, and this is comparing the top relative to the bottom. And in terms of injuries, is actually the opposite, seems to be going up. The second paper focuses, second and third actually are somewhat similar in terms of methodology, but the second paper looks at episodic memory and grip strength in these countries, in Europe, US, Mexico, South Korea, and China. And what I found quite interesting is a little bit of the contrast in terms of the age declines in, for example, episodic memory, that we see a decline in the US, somewhat an improvement in England, in some Nordic countries, but somewhat constant age pattern in the Mediterranean, Europe. But interestingly, they seem to be a decline not across Mexico, because there was sort of a heterogeneity in there, but at least in some of those cohorts, they seem to, at least from the figures I pick, that there seem to be a decline in those in the late 50s, early 60s, and in China from the 1945s to the, say, early 1960s. That is related in some way to the third paper, I'm sorry, because that one looks at this similar idea on age patterns of, sorry, let me go to the grip strength. What I found interesting in the grip strength is that it looked quite consistent decline across all countries, although a little bit nuances in some of them, but mostly consistent decline. And in terms of the paper in Ghana, in Africa, which, as Eileen indicated, is one of the few papers we have had over the years from an African area. In Ghana, we see that this, in terms of self-reported health, it looks like the later born cohorts are reporting more, going towards the poor self-report. There doesn't seem to be much in terms of depressive symptoms by cohort, gender, or education. The last paper that we unfortunately were unable to see, what they find is when they look at frailty, and I'll explain in a minute what they mean by frailty, they look at these changes by gender, and they find actually quite large gender gap differences, women having much higher frailty relative to males. And this gap is quite important in some countries like Cuba, Dominican Republic, Peru, and Mexico. Mortality is much higher in the frail versus the no frail, which I think something that we might have expected. But what I found quite interesting is that in these countries like China, Venezuela, and Mexico, they have almost twice as high mortality relative to what one would observe in Cuba between frail and non-frail. So when one puts all these pieces together, these ones in particular, the ones that relate with cohorts, it seems that we observe some similarities in some countries, in some outcomes, for example, some similarities in terms of the grip strength or perhaps in frailty, but not in others. As we saw, the US seems to be going down in terms of the episodic memory in later born cohorts. So we also saw that later born cohorts seem to be doing quite well in some countries, but there is quite a lot of variability between countries and also across the outcomes. So for me, although those are, I understand, are exploratory studies, what I would like to uh, put a pledge on is you have individual level data. So there is a reason why we started collecting surveys, because it are enrich our understanding. So I think you might want to consider including these life course experiences into the mix as you're trying to explain why is it that we observe some consistency in some outcomes, but some discrepancy in others. In particular, because you have countries that are quite diverge in focus. The first paper is a little bit different, as I indicated, because it looks at period data. So it would be also interesting to look at these relative changes in mortality we saw in the previous session when they were looking at more maternal mortality, that they look at absolute but also relative changes. So the first paper, most of the work has been done on looking at absolute changes in mortality. So I think it would be interesting to look at relative changes too. Going back to the issue of including these cohort experiences, all the papers that use cohort data, these people were born throughout the 20th century. In the HRS and the European countries come from the early 20th, and the most from Mexico, China, and Ghana come from the second part of the 20th century. But in these places, there have been massive changes. For example, in epidemiological transition, in particular in the low and middle income countries. The nutritional transition, which I found quite interesting, that none of the papers, at least in the presentations that I saw, none of them mention anything related to the nutritional transition, and that is quite important because, for example, in the case of Ghana, there have been increases in metabolic indicators along the lines of overweight and obesity, and also they seem to have increases in the prevalence of cardiovascular indicators along the lines of blood pressure. So those are indicators that are pretty much along the lines of how the nutritional transition has been evolving in those countries, and also in terms of the economic and political turmoil that has happened in those countries. Ghana is one example, but also Latin America is another. And for the high-income countries, those people went through 2 world wars. So I think it is important to consider what has happened. So very quickly, because in the interest of time, the first paper, let me go into the papers. I'm not going to spend too much time on these main results because they have already been sort of discussed more generally, but I want to provide a few of the suggestions. The first one, it struck me a little bit when I look at this paper, at least the methodology that was able to gather from the slides. It wasn't clear to me if the rates have been age standardized. And it wasn't clear to me if age is included in it, at least the way the regressions were described. I would also suggest that you might consider estimating these models by age groups, because where you are at the end of the day are looking at the age pattern of mortality. And the age pattern of mortality is quite different by causes of death. And you have several causes of death there that could be important. Also look at sex differences. For me, that's quite important because you're including in there things along the lines of lung cancer, for example, or cardiovascular conditions. The two-step process that you describe seems to be somewhat similar to what we use a lot in health to assess socioeconomic differences. This is what we call slope index of inequality. That's somewhat what you're doing, but I think you might want to consider also estimating what is called the relative index of inequality. And this relative index of inequality allows one to look, as I was indicating, not also the absolute difference, but all the relative difference. And these are all indicators that are regression-based type of indicators. You already computed one of them. Moving into the second study that uses the grip strength and the memory, I already described a little bit the results, and some of the suggestions that I would have for this paper in particular is that the current paper seems to treat the outcome as continuous, even though the outcome is really discrete because you're counting this periodic memory. It goes from either has 1, 2, or 3, or 4, and so on episodic memory, but it looks like it is continuous. And I wonder if it would make a difference to estimate a model that is more appropriate for this counting process. And the reason is because the variability might be different, and because you are trying to estimate this by age. I would imagine as you get to older ages, there would be quite different variability in the memory, episodic memory, as opposed to when you are among the young ages, and also because it would allow you to sort of take into account some of the non-linearities that one might expect to see. What also caught my eye as a demographer is that when I look at the way the model is estimated, that resembles quite a lot what we call the age period cohort model. You are estimating the model in the mixed method kind of framework. But the reason why I think that is important is because that if that is indeed the case, then you might consider including what is called the cross-classified effects, which is what I was referring to. You would be able to assess attributes of the cohorts or perhaps the countries to try to assess why is it that in some countries you seem to have an improvement in later born cohorts and in other ones that doesn't seem to be the case. What is it about the cohort that makes them look that way in contrast to the other cohorts? And that one is somewhat similar to paper number 3 that uses similar methodology, although this paper uses a different data set. The idea in here is to look at two indicators, self-reported health and depressive symptoms. Now the age range in here is a little bit broader. It goes from 30 onwards. What I found also interesting is that the results didn't seem to have differ by gender education. I did not see those results in the table, so I would like to see them just to make sure there is something in there or something could be interesting. What I also found interesting is when one fits this type of growth curve models, part of the variability comes from how many data points one might have. In your case, you seem to have only 3 data points in terms of time trends. So I wonder if you might want to consider looking first at the data if it varies that much over time. It would also be informative, I think, to look at the distribution of education. You indicated there was no differences by education, but I would like to see how the educational differences look like. What kind of educational groups are you creating? Because if the distribution is fairly low, it might be really hard to find something. And also would be useful, I think, to dichotomize self-reported health, because we usually dichotomize this outcome instead of looking at every single value that comes from the question. We usually dichotomize into poor versus non-poor. That's the more traditional way of doing it. And the way you're doing it is you're treating it as a continuous. So that usually creates a very biased estimates on the extremes. And similar comment as in the previous one, you also have an APC. And your case is even more clear because you have the triple interaction. So you're trying to disentangle the identification of the APC components by having an interaction at a higher level. But again, you should be able or could be able to do a little bit more to explain those differences. So very quickly, let me move into the last paper that we were unable to see. But let me walk you quickly through it. So what they were assessing is differences in frailty and mortality using the 1066 cohort studies. That includes, in this particular case, I included 6 countries from Latin America: Cuba, Dominican Republic, Peru, Venezuela, Mexico, and Puerto Rico, and data from China. So some of the findings that they have is that the incidence of frailty seems to be very high among women. In particular, there is large gender gaps in these particular countries, and the differences in mortality seems to be much higher in other countries relative to what they see in Cuba. So to give you a sense, this is how they measure frailty. They have all these 5 different indicators, but in their case, they don't have a grip strength. So frailty for them is having any 2 of the 4 remaining indicators, either weight loss, exhaustion, slow walking speed, or low physical activity. Having 2 of those could be considered frail. And then here is the quick view of the data. This is data that is comes from these surveys that are based on cities. And they have a representation for urban and rural cities. Here are the results that I was just describing that we weren't able to see. Here are the gender differences in the prevalence of frailty. So you can see the blue lines are for women and the darker blue and the lighter blue are for males. And what observes, I put this in here so you can see the large gap difference within Mexico, large difference in Peru, large difference in Dominican Republic, and more narrower differences in Bolivia or in China or even in Puerto Rico. In terms of mortality, here are the mortality ratios that they computed. This is the mortality among the non-frail, and this is among the frail cases. So for these cases, about 285 high mortality once you look at the relative risks, and this is relative to what one would observe in Cuba. So it looks like most of these places would have had much higher relative risks on frail versus non-frail with respect to Cuba. Most of these analyses seem to have been done pooling kind of the data. As you can see in here, they have a pool analysis, which is interesting. But on the other hand, they kind of combine the heterogeneity across all these different countries. So some of the suggestions that I was going to propose was that they might want to look at controlling for some of the country-specific attributes to assess perhaps the between country differences. Or instead of pulling the countries, you might want to look at the countries more differently. And in particular, in the case of frailty, here is one of the figures when they have the incidence of frailty. The incidence looks quite different if one were to look at a younger, meaning younger than 80, in contrast to the 80 and plus. Once you put everybody together, the groups are being pulled by this large rate. And when one looks at younger than 50, there is a clear group of countries that are lumped together at the bottom. And here are the countries like Mexico, Venezuela, and Peru are sort of at the bottom, and it is until they jump into the 80s that the prevalence goes up. So you might not want to combine the two together. So in the interest of time, I think I'm gonna stop there.